Hey guys, this video is for APUS. Remember to watch this video from start to finish. Um, I have one to watch this one, and then I'm going to have another one for you tomorrow to watch as well. So make sure you do that, and then we'll be pretty much done with the 1920s. So just remember to do that. Watch this video start to finish, and then watch the one on Wednesday. Also, I gave you a reading assignment. And originally, I said it's due on Wednesday, but I'm going to make it due for next Monday, like next time we meet for live classes. If you want to do it before, if you want to do it and hand it in on Wednesday, so you don't have anything to worry about over Thanksgiving, that's fine, that's good. But if you want to wait and you want to do it like over the weekend, then that's fine too. So it's completely up to you how you want to do that. All right, so today we're going to talk about, continue talking about the culture clash in the 1920s. Remember, American society was divided during this time, between urbanites and rural people, between wets and dries, between Protestants and Catholics, between young people who were more liberal minded and more traditional minded conservative people. So the 1920s was full of cultural divides. And one of those divides that existed in 1920s society was the divide over religion and a clash between religion and science. Now, fundamentalist Christianity made a great comeback in the 1920s. Now, remember, American society is always religious anyway, right? We had all these awakenings, right? First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening. Religion was kind of the foundation of a lot of social movements in the United States, both liberal and conservative. So religion plays, our founders were religious, like the Puritans and the Pilgrims and all of that. So religion plays religion plays a very important role in American life. But sometimes it waxes and wanes. There are periods, I wouldn't say there's ever really a secular period in American history where religion isn't important, but there were definitely times when religion in American history was more important. And the 1920s was definitely one of those times. It was a major comeback of fundamentalist Christianity. Now, what is a fundamentalist? A fundamentalist Christian is somebody who believes that the Bible is word for word from God, including the creation story from the book of Genesis. So basically, the Bible comes straight from God. It cannot be compromised. Anything that contradicts the Bible by its very nature is untrue. So that's what a fundamentalist Christian is, and also they're evangelical usually, meaning they want to spread their religion to others. So fundamentalist Christianity was very big in the 1920s. One of the biggest preachers of the time was a man named Billy Sunday, who I think I mentioned him before. He was a baseball player, professional baseball player, who had a deep religious experience and then devoted the rest of his life to spreading the word of Jesus Christ. So he was very, very popular in the 1920s. He used to go around, trying to bring people closer to Christ. Probably the most famous evangelist. Now, evangelist is someone who tries to spread the Christian faith. Probably the most famous evangelist of the 1920s was a woman named Amy Semple McPherson. McPherson was a Canadian, and she came to the United States. She was pretty fundamentalist. She was a Pentecostal, a member of that faith, and she had a radio show in the mid 1920s that was enormously popular. She actually set up her own church called the Angelus Temple. And a lot of the fans of hers, a lot of the people of her radio show, a lot of people who went to her temple out in California were Midwestern transplants, people who had grown up in like an environment of pretty strict Christianity. She was very theatrical, could really hold an audience, on radio and in person. They called her Sister Amy. And her church, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, it was called. It was a version of Pentecostalism. And she was very, very popular. She ultimately lost some of her popularity because she staged a kidnapping disappearance when she was actually with some guy in Mexico. And then she mysteriously came back, washed ashore. She swam to shore and said, "I'm rescued. I'm saved." I don't mean in a religious sense. I mean like, I'm saved from being kidnapped. And a lot of people didn't buy that story, so she actually lost. She actually lost some of her popularity as a result. But she continued being fairly prominent into the 1930s and into the 1940s. She ultimately died of a drug overdose in the 1940s. So yeah, but she was very, very popular in the 1920s. I think her church, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, I think it's actually still around to this day. Now, religion, the rise of all this fundamentalist Christianity in the 1920s kind of ran head on into science because there are a lot of things in fundamentalist Christianity and a lot of the scientific innovations that we're finding out about that clash, right? And science was actually becoming a lot more important to a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people in the 1920s. And a Harvard philosopher, a man named Alfred Whitehead, he actually put it this way: well, individually powerless scientists were the real rulers of the world. Now, a lot of people who were more pro-science in the 1920s just looked around and they said, look what science has done. They made such advances in the early 20th century. A lot of ancient diseases were finally being tackled. A lot of things that used to kill off tons of people back in the day, were now being controlled. Life expectancy was much higher. There was less infant mortality. So there was like made actually treatment for some diseases, but apart from bleeding people. So like there were a lot of innovations that came out of science, and a lot of people kind of looked to those innovations and said that, science is kind of where it's at. But there were some Americans who were divided over science. Because some embraced it and said this is great, it can really change the world for the better. But there were others who felt that science threatened religious values. And science subjected the Bible to scrutiny, right? There's a lot of things that might be in the Bible that people who are strictly science might find a little, a little hard to believe. So a lot of people who were very religious felt very threatened by science. Sociologists and psychologists, remember this was like the peak of Freud's influence within the 1920s, and a lot of people who were into sociology and psychology, psychiatry especially, began looking at the whole topic of religion and saying that religion is just comes from a deep need that people have to kind of explain the unexplainable. So they were trying to give like a scientific explanation for why people are religious. Freud himself said that religion was necessary in ancient times to explain what couldn't be understood, but now we understand a lot of those things, so there's less need for religion anymore. Now, all this kind of talk and explanation, a lot of religious people found very threatening, and they also found very condescending, right? Like when some intellectual is trying to explain why you have the faith that you do, a lot of people feel very, very threatened by that. Now, probably the topic that religious people found the most objectionable of a lot of modern science was the theory of evolution. Now, remember, the theory of evolution had been advanced by Charles Darwin back in the 1800s. Interestingly, Darwin had been a divinity student. He was actually studying to be a minister. But Darwin came up with the theory in his book, Origin of Species, that species evolve into higher beings. So that both human beings and both man and apes have a common ancestor. Not that we came straight from apes, but both apes and humans came from a common ancestor. So that was his theory, but religious people found that highly, highly objectionable. And evolution turned out to be a highly charged issue because it ran completely counter to the creation story of the Bible, right? The creation story, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the snake, and all of that. The thing is, that's clearly at odds with a lot of the theories of evolution that were, rising to prominence among a lot of people who are into science. So if that could be knocked down, the creation story, then a lot of religious people were concerned, well, what else is next? The foundations of our whole religion could be critiqued in this manner. So evolution was probably the issue that religious people found most objectionable about science. And it got very, very political, the issue of evolution. Legislatures, which were around the country, which tended to be dominated by evangelical Christians, fundamentalist Christians, particularly in the South and the Midwest, just began banning schools from teaching evolution. The governor of Texas, Miriam Ferguson, was actually the first woman governor of a state, interestingly. But she was not a progressive. Despite that, she was actually quite conservative. And Governor Ferguson actually censored all the textbooks personally that students in her state were going to read. And she wanted to make sure there was no mention of evolution. I am a Christian mother, and I will not let that rot go into Texas textbooks, she said, talking about evolution. Now, probably the most prominent political opponent of the teaching of evolution was one of the most famous politicians of the era, a man named William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan had been the Democratic nominee for president in 1896, 1900, 1908, three times. He had been the Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. He was very left wing. Very, I won't say a socialist. I don't think he was a socialist, but he was very liberal. Basically believed the government has to have a large role in trying to improve people's lives, believed in big regulation of business. His most famous position, of course, was back up the money with silver. He gave that speech, "You can't crucify mankind on a cross of gold." He gave that speech back in 1896. And he got the nomination as a 36-year-old just basically based on that speech because that so wowed a lot of the delegates. So he was kind of known as like this liberal icon politically, William Jennings Bryan, probably the precursor to progressivism. In many ways, he was more left than a lot of progressives. But at the same time, William Jennings Bryan was a fundamentalist Christian. And at first, that might seem strange to some modern ears, right? Then you might say, well, I thought he was so liberal, but he's also a fundamentalist Christian. But in his mind, it actually wasn't inconsistent. Bryan actually said he's for the common man. The common man needs help from greedy businessmen. The common man needs protection from the government. And also, the common man's religion, evangelical Christianity, should be respected. So for him, it all went together. His very liberal political and economic beliefs, but also his deep faith and his deep support for fundamentalist Christianity being accepted and not critiqued really by anybody else, because he almost interpreted it as, when fundamentalist Christianity was being critiqued and attacked, he was interpreting that to mean here are the educated urban elite coming after regular folk. They're even coming after their religion. So for him, it all kind of went one and the same, his liberal politics and his evangelical Christian beliefs. Now, this whole thing came to a climax, this whole debate over evolution, in 1925. The state of Tennessee banned the teaching of evolution in the schools. Now, the preeminent civil liberties group in the United States, then and now, the ACLU, felt that this was completely inappropriate. That, basically, if evolution is being banned in schools, then basically that's and creationism has to be taught, right? The whole creation story. That's basically putting religion in schools, and that's a violation of the First Amendment. So the ACLU actually offered, I would say offered, but actually asked any teacher, any science teacher in Tennessee to challenge the evolution law or the anti-evolution law in Texas. And they finally found a taker, a man named John Scopes. Scopes was a very young high school biology teacher in a city called Dayton, Tennessee. And he basically wanted to test decided to take the ACLU up on its offer and decided to test the anti-evolution law. And all he did in class was summarize what evolution was, what Darwin's theories about evolution were. And for that, he was arrested. Now, his subsequent trial became one of the most celebrated incidents of the 1920s. He was put on trial by the people of Dayton, Tennessee for violating this law, and the trial became highly publicized throughout the country. It kind of became a nationwide thing, and it was kind of seen as the culture clash of the 1920s in microcosm. Modern, I won't say urban yet because it's a rural area, but modern values, science, at war with the traditional Christian faith and traditional beliefs of of a lot of Americans who are kind of clinging to an old way of life as things as the rest of American society was changing. So the Scopes monkey trial, as it was called, Scopes, it was named Monkey because it's theory of evolution. The Scopes monkey trial was kind of seen as the 1920s culture clash in microcosm. Now, Clarence Darrow, who is probably one of my heroes, who's probably the nation's most famous lawyers and a prominent religious skeptic, also somebody who took on unpopular causes. That was his thing. And he was a fantastic lawyer. He rarely, if ever, lost a case. And Darrow decided that he was going to volunteer to defend John Scopes. And the prosecution, the ragtag group of prosecutors out there in Dayton, Tennessee, they decided to ask William Jennings Bryan himself, this legendary politician, to actually help the prosecution. So even though he wasn't like a credentialed prosecutor in Tennessee, I don't think he had passed the Tennessee bar or anything. He's from Nebraska. But bringing Bryan on board kind of made this trial get even more attention because William Jennings Bryan was the most prominent, one of the most prominent politicians of his era. So it was kind of seen as Clarence Darrow, the most famous lawyer in America, defender of liberal causes, versus one of the most prominent politicians in America, William Jennings Bryan. Now, Bryan conducted most of the prosecution. When the trial took place in Dayton, Tennessee, it was the summer of 1925, sweltering heat, over 100 degrees. The courtroom was packed, heavily covered by national media. And a whole bunch of people decided to use this opportunity to make some money. A whole bunch of vendors decided to sell little toy monkeys outside the courthouse. So it kind of had almost a carnival atmosphere, the whole trial. Heavily covered by the radio and newspapers. Now, Bryan was actually called even though he's the prosecutor, he was actually called as a witness to testify as an expert on the Bible. And the thing is that, he was just a regular person. He wasn't a preacher or a religious scholar or anything, but like he said, I was willing to testify as just a deeply devout Christian about the truthfulness of the Bible. And Bryan appealed to this deep fear in rural America, in more traditional parts of America, of a changing society. A lot of people just felt very threatened by a lot of the things that were going on in the 1920s. Flappers flapping, jazz music, the country becoming increasingly urbanized. So a lot of this defiance of prohibition. So there were a lot of things that made acceptance of Catholicism. So there were just a lot of things that made a lot of traditional minded Americans very frightened about the way America was changing. And evolution was seen as just one of those things. And Bryan appealed to that sense in a lot of Americans that, it was just scary about how much society was changing. That even traditional religion is being abandoned in favor of these, strange new scientific ideas. Now, Bryan used his crusade against evolution in a similar way as his crusade against the gold standard back in the 1890s. He almost saw it as the same way, that the gold standard was just a way to kind of help wealthy Eastern bankers at the expense of the common man. And he viewed the attack on creationism in the Bible as yet another elite attempt to go after the values of the common man. But Bryan had a very embarrassing performance on the stand. Darrow asked him all these questions. He said, "You're a biblical scholar. That's the way you're presenting yourself." So he asked him all these questions about the Bible. He said, "Do you literally think these are true? Like Jonah and the whale. Do you think Jonah was literally swallowed by a whale?" Which is a story in the Bible. Adam and Eve. Eve came from Adam's rib. Darrow asked Bryan, "Do you really think that women came from the rib of man?" The first two people were Adam and Eve. They had two sons, Cain and Abel. Both Cain and Abel were married in the Bible. So Darrow said, well, if they were the only four people in the world, where did their wives come from? So Darrow was really challenging Bryan, and Bryan was finally forced to sort of kind of concede that a lot of these things are metaphors. And the thing is that kind of knocks down the whole fundamentalist argument, right? If it's word for word from God, but then you're saying, oh, they're all metaphor, a lot of these are metaphors, then that really, really harms the fundamentalist case. So Bryan's performance actually was seen as kind of an embarrassment when he was called up to the stand. Tragically, Brian died of a heart attack a few days after the trial. It was enormously stressful, and sweltering heat, and I think it was too much for him. He actually died in the town like a few days after the trial, which he won. Scopes was convicted because Scopes did violate the law against teaching evolution, even though the conviction was ultimately overturned on a technicality. So he never went to jail or anything. I don't think he was ever going to go to jail. I think it was just a fine. He was going to be fined $100 for violating the law. But even though Scopes lost technically the Scopes monkey trial, generally the case was seen as more of a triumph of modern values over religion because it made a successful critique of a lot of the fundamentalist tenets that a lot of Americans had believed. And it's seen as a classic battle between traditional religion and modern values. They made a movie about it, which was called "Inherit the Wind." It was a movie in the early '60s that was based on the Scopes monkey trial, even though they changed the characters' names. But the legacy of the Scopes monkey trial, fundamentalism survived and remained very strong in a lot of parts of this country, especially in the South and the West. It still was, and to this day, they call it the Bible Belt, right? It's still heavily, heavily Christian, and not just any old Christian. It's like fundamentalist Christianity still remains very strong. Religion still governs the life of many Americans to this day and actually informs a lot of their political decisions, right? Where they stand, their religious beliefs often influence where they stand on political issues. Radio preachers, traveling preachers, they continued spreading the old time religion. There's a whole gospel song called that. Give me the old time religion. And they continued being very prominent, and evolution still remained a very controversial issue. I would argue that even to this day, it's still a controversial issue. Of course, there's overwhelming scientific evidence, but there's a lot of people who feel that all of this, talk about evolution is a threat to traditional values, that it's not true, first of all, because the Bible is true, and that if, you start teaching kids evolution, then you're just going to get them to kind of like, undermine a lot of their other religious values. Now they call creationism, now they call intelligent design. And some religious people, most of them don't actually say, oh, evolution should be taught, but they usually say, well, both should be taught, evolution and intelligent design. Of course, the argument against that is that in school, you learn science, right? You don't learn religion, at least in public school. A religious school, you can learn whatever. But in public school, you have to learn about science, and, not religious belief. And, people who are for evolution argue that, teaching creationism or intelligent design, it would be teaching a religious belief in the schools, and they say that's quite troubling. All right, guys, very good. So remember, I hope you watch this video from start to finish. In our next video tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the 1928 election, which was another example of the culture clash of the 1920s in microcosm. So I'll see you in the next video tomorrow. Peace.